ultimately we're going to have to change to see who God really is and base our government on who God is in love rather than the systems that we've developed. And I think that's the only hope, I think, is that more and more people discover God and discover his love and therefore start loving each other, that will eventually change the world. And Jesus didn't say it was revolution. He says it was an infiltration, like leaven leavening the whole lump.
The first thing I wanted to ask today, and then I'll let Jeff go on. It's a very simple thing, probably because I don't understand things very well. The Bible starts with, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth."
Mm.
And then when you get into John, it says, "All things," referring to Christ, "were made by him, and without him was not anything made."
Yeah.
This. When I think about that, I think that the metaverse, everything was made by Christ. Everything that exists was made by Christ. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, in the sense, obviously, you've got God, Father, Son, and Spirit, and the Father is not the Son, and the Father's not the Spirit, and Jesus is not the thing, but they're all God. So you've got this sort of picture. There's a really nice picture of this sort of knot that sort of goes around a sort of triangle type of thing that says, well, they're all God, but they're not each other. So there are roles, you could say, and obviously it is metaphorical. The Word was with God. Well, yeah, we can say the Bible says Jesus is the Word. But what does that mean? Obviously, evangelically, that people will start taking that to mean the Bible rather than Jesus himself. But it's not Jesus himself. It's a term for the creative power of God that formed everything out of his thoughts by words, intentions, you could say. You know, we think of words as things you say, but God doesn't have a mouth per se in the same way. We like to give God sort of things that have hands and mouth and eyes and things like that. But you know, God essentially is spirit, so he uses words to help us understand things from his perspective. So his intentional thoughts formed everything. And for us, it helps us to think, oh, he spoke it into being, and therefore the word was with God in the beginning, and the word was God. Therefore, God was word. Now, the word there, logos, could also mean, you know, the logic of God. We tend to think of it as words, but in the Mirror Bible, it describes it as the logic of God. And what is the logic of God? Well, you could say God's essence in how he thinks and views everything, his way of seeing things. So yeah, you could then go into Colossians and you see, yeah, all things were created by him and for him, but that doesn't mean independently of God as a whole. You know, it's not like, oh, everything was formed for Jesus, and therefore, well, where's the Father in that? Well, the Father's in Jesus, and Jesus is in the Father. So, you know, it's a sort of this Trinitarian view of things, which has some element of mystery to it. You know, and I've met each of Father, Son, and Spirit face to face and personally in lots of different ways. And I've learned to discern their um, essence and fragrance, if you like, their personality, you could say. So when I meet with somebody, because for me, people say, oh, what does the Father look like? Well, the Father looks like the Son. Yes, it's like, you know, and what does the Son look like? Well, the Son for me looks like the Prince of Peace, because that's how I saw him when I first saw the Son. But then when I look in the face of the Father, I see the same face, but I don't feel the same frequency. So there's the sense of what I see with my eyes, which are familiar pictures that help me engage. But then there's the essence of the God energy. God is spirit, God is light, God is love. I feel and sense that in a way which is very personal and very intimate and maybe different from what everyone else feels, perhaps. But it's all good, you know. And I think we tend to in the Western world, we tend to like things all neatly packaged. So if we can sort of understand Jesus as the Word of God and as the Son of God, and then we can understand the Father, and we can, and but they're God. You know, they're never not in communication or knowing or connected. But sometimes the way they interact with us is more like father, brother, mother, friend, Lord, king, all these terminologies we use for different aspects of a way of understanding, the awesomeness and wonder of God himself. But you can't define God in any way which limits him, because he's limitless, so it helps us connect, but I don't think it's actually how it is. It's the best we can use, using words that give us an understanding of something. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So therefore you can't separate Jesus from God, obviously, but then Jesus isn't a word. Yeah, he's a person, he's the person of God, in that way. But the word gives a connotation of speaking, and speaking has a connotation of energy, of when you speak. There's a frequency that you speak, and those words have energy, and those words have life, because he's also life. God is love, God is life, God is spirit. So it's very difficult when you want to define it, and I don't think we're supposed to. We're supposed to experience him and know him, her, they, in all that sense, in an intimate relational way that makes us feel his children, the family's children. We're part of the family, which helps us understand relationship and communion and fellowship and sharing and participation. And there are words like being co-heirs, which has a sort of sense of, oh, there's something here that we're also involved with on a bigger scale than just our own individual person, which in other things is called creation or the cosmos, or different ways of describing it all, really, I think. But I think the mystery must remain, and therefore each individual will connect to God in ways which are different from each other, and will find facets of God and commune with those facets of God differently at different times on our journey. My journey has been engaging God as Father, Son, Spirit in different ways at different times, in different ways that were helpful to help me know them and to know me.
So, Mike, if you were talking, sorry, Jeff, for continuing. If you were talking to, say, someone like a Muslim or someone, and they look at us as polytheistic because of three gods, would you try to explain it, or would you just go by experience? Because really, everything you've said up till now is really, I have to experience them.
Yeah,
To
absolutely.
really get it. And because it's a mystery. I'm never going to understand three is one. It's a mystery.
Not in a way. And I think we think of Islam and other religions, some of them being polytheistic, some of them monotheistic. But actually, when you look back into the history of Islam, they chose a moon god out of other gods. And then they developed that into a monotheistic thing, Allah. But actually, if you go back into the very roots of it, they were polytheistic when they started. They just chose the moon god. Hence, we have the crescent moon associated with those type of things. Most Muslims don't know that because they don't know their own history, and they don't know where it came from. In that sense, they sort of live from the Quran, and from the teaching of the imams and all that sort of stuff. But they don't really know God, because their God does not allow for relationship. It is a blind trust of Allah, who is sovereign, and therefore everything that happens must be the will of Allah. It leaves out the relational and the interaction and the communicative part of that. So I would not really try and argue with any Muslim about anything, I would talk to them about their experience. Can you know God? Can you know Allah? And they would probably say, oh, no, we can't do that. Allah's holy. So there's a sense where, well, actually, then, well, I do know God. I have a personal relationship with him in which there's communication and sharing and life and joy and peace and love, and use words which are evocative of good experiences rather than fear, which is what a lot of they are associated with their God. They're afraid to get it wrong.
One of our difficulties, though, in knowing God is that each one of us, because we're individuals, know God based on our mindsets. And so if I talk to, as I have for the holidays, my one son who's become extremely religious, and his knowing God is different than, say, how Jeff would know God. And because of his mindset with a little presence on, he believes that's what it is. And it's a kind of a different God. He's more of a harsh God, and
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Because his knowing is by intellectual understanding of a concept rather than a relationship with a person that is loving and kind and good and gentle and all of the fruit of the spirit. Where do you get angry, harsh, judgmental in the fruit of the spirit? You don't, because it isn't there and it isn't in God. God does make judgments based on verdicts, evidence, but those evidence, that verdicts are always going to be his judgment. It's going to come out of his love. And that is the problem with intellectual knowledge, theology, the understanding or study of God through an external medium of the Word, the Bible. That's how they know God, through what the Bible says about God. Well, the Bible says very different things about God in the Old Testament and the New Testament, because in the Old Testament they didn't know God. They thought they knew God, and they had their own understanding that they created in their own religion of God, but he wasn't the God that Jesus came to reveal, which is why Jesus came. Jesus came to reveal the true nature of God as love and to help them have a relationship with the Father, because they didn't have the God as Father. In one sense, they had a wider concept of God as creator, but the relationship as father and son, when Jesus said Abba, it was scandalous to them. When he said, I am the Father of one, it was like, oh, you can't say that. And it's because they had a view of God which was very much coming out of religious knowledge and not experience. Because let's face it, only one of them could go in and meet with God once a year. And that was very much on the basis of, we're terrible sinners, we need to atone for our sin, will you forgive us, sort of thing. It wasn't a relationship, it was a transaction from their perspective. So they had a transactional sort of knowledge of God, which you could say was covenantal, but they didn't understand the nature of covenant as God fulfilling his self within the covenant.
If they didn't do it that way, they'd be killed, sort of thing. Like it's not like God really showed himself to them.
Well, he tried, but they wouldn't have it. He wanted them to come up on the mountain when they came out of Egypt. And he invited them to come up into his presence, into that spiritual dynamic of his presence. They were afraid. Why were they afraid? Because they had 430 years of fear living under Pharaoh. And they had very little sense of, what they started with obviously Israel, Jacob, and the sons and all of that. But even then, their relationship with God was sort of Abraham, in a dream, put to sleep to come into the presence of God. There was sort of it never really started off in what Jesus came to reveal. So we have all of these ways, and they had their own version of God. like they carried around idols all the way through the wilderness and into the promised land from Egypt, which is what Stephen said and is revealed in other places as well, that they carried these things around with them. So, and they made a golden calf because they wanted something like other people's gods, whereas God invited them to come up into the fire of his presence, which is a love, but they saw it as something to be feared, and therefore they sent a mediator, Moses, to go on their behalf, and the 70 elders also went with him on their behalf. And then they set up a religious system on their behalf so that they could have some connection with God at a distance, which was what they wanted. And you don't really get people having any sense of intimacy with God. You've got like Gideon, who sort of meets an angel, and you have sort of experiences. And then the prophets sort of have more of a sense of hearing God speak to them or communicating things from God, to which I'm sure they were quite shocked by some of the things they said, because that's when it started to turn around. Ooh, sacrifices and offerings you never required. Oh, our whole system is based on sacrifices and offerings. What are we saying? And all of a sudden they start saying things in leading up to the new covenant to reveal what God was truly like and to fulfill all of those promises that they felt through their own understanding, to reveal them in the truth of Jesus being the way, the truth, and the life, and the express image of God, and being one with the Father, and having a relationship of I am. And I think, that for me is, my favorite chapter in the Bible has always been John 14, in which Jesus describes the relationship and describes going to the cross, coming back in resurrection, enabling them to have relationship in which they would know, whereas where I am, you may be also. And of course, that's been totally trashed in the meaning to mean, oh, heaven in the future, where it actually means where I am in relationship. So then Jesus says, I am in the Father and the Father's in me. And that's the relationship he was describing that they would have. And then later on it says, on that day, resurrection day, you will know this relationship. You will know I'm in you and you're in me, and we're in this relationship with the Father together, which is what he came to unveil, that there was no veil. Yeah, hence the veil of the temple was torn, so that it showed there was never any thing. And then they sort of go back when they're looking at, well, the Gentiles can come into this. Everyone, they didn't get it even then. I mean, you can imagine Jesus being with them for 3.5 years, and they still didn't get the fact that this was for everybody. He came to take away the sin of the world, not the sin of the Jews. But they still didn't get it. So, oh no, we can't touch Gentile people because they're unclean. And Jesus, what the sort of revelation comes from heaven in the vision. Don't call anything unclean that I call clean. Take, taste and eat as a symbol of, hey, you're all one now. There is no separation and division in that. And of course, then they describe that this is the tabernacle of David, which was, no temple or holy of holies or structure, God in their midst, which is what they celebrated for quite a while, of dancing and celebrating in the presence of the ark, not hidden away in a box somewhere. And then, I guess the sad thing, and I've asked this question a lot. I thought, well, why did David then want to go and build a temple for God that they just experienced and enjoyed in their midst? And maybe because the timing of Jesus coming was not yet. Things had not yet reached the point where Jesus was going to come. And therefore, there was another system that was set up through David Solomon building the temple and all of that. And eventually, the next temple with Herod and everything. So, it's this whole thing, which when I look at what Jesus came to help us come into, which was he was the door so we could come into a relationship with the Father, then Jesus made us to be a dwelling place or a habitation of God, which was what it was all about and what John 14 was describing. You will be like me in this relationship with the Father. But they never had that before. None of them. Even John the Baptist, who was the greatest, it says, of the Old Testament prophets, the least in the kingdom is greater than he. We look at those things. Oh, look at all the miracles they did. Look at the amazing things that happened. They did not know him. He was not in them like he's in us. So there's a huge difference, which is why I think that's what we go back to. You can know God for yourself. God already dwells in you. He lives in you and he wants you to know him in that inner relationship. And that's what I would encourage people to experience. And, if anything, that's what I would share with others who have not had that experience, to help them possibly think, wow, I'd like that. And so I wouldn't argue theology with a Muslim over the Quran or the Bible or Abraham and all the other things people try and use to find some sort of common ground. I would just go on, okay, do you know God by experience? Do you have a relationship with him through experience? And then share the testimony of your experience with God, which hopefully would open their eyes potentially to things. Now, let's face it, God is awakening the Muslim world. There's huge revival going on in Muslim countries. People are having visitations of Jesus in dreams. There's great transformation. The gospel is spreading in places like Iran under persecution greatly. More so than, in our sort of Western, oh yeah, Jesus, yeah, sort of culture of Christmas, Easter, but nothing much else. And because we've sort of got inoculated from it all, because it's become another religion rather than the relationship that God wants us to all have and wants all his children to experience and know. So yeah, definitely stick with the relationship and presenting God as a good God, a loving God, a kind God, rather than the angry, judgmental God who's so distant that we can't really know him. And one day we might. Because I don't think Muslims have much certainty within their relationship because it's based on performance. And if they don't perform to a particular standard, then they won't make it.
Some Christianity's like that too.
Well, yes, it is. That's often the sort of the works-based, you got to be good enough. You got to keep a standard. You got to perform. You've got to keep the Bible and live according to the manual, rather than Jesus.
Salvation.
Yeah, Jesus made it very simple. Come and follow me. He didn't make it hard, did he? He didn't say, do this, and this, and this, and this. And he just said, come and follow me. Because he invited them into a relationship. And then he opened the door for them to have a relationship with the Father and the Spirit, through following him.
The problem is we're so, I guess probably it's the same around the world. We're so used to having to earn a wage. And the same way we earn God's favor, and then we expect when I work, I expect to be paid at the end of the week. I expect to pay back with God. And, I did this, and it's just a natural thing. And if I screw up at work bad enough, they're going to fire me. And if I screw up with God bad enough, something bad's going to happen to me. And my initial reaction when things aren't going well is, what did I do? Rather than, no, that's not what he doesn't do anything to me, even when I screw up.
No. And the fact is, we have generated and created a system based on our own understanding through the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which effectively is our way of doing things independently of God.
Yeah.
And because in everyone, eternity is in the heart of everyone, and now God is actually in the spirit of everybody, there is this sort of deeper need for love, for something beyond. And even the richest people in the world and the most famous and the most successful, they're not the happiest, are they?
Yeah.
They're sort of, when you look at the tragedy of all those who commit suicide, and it's just, or hooked on drugs, or and I find, I look at people's lives, and others aspire to be like them, and aspire to be beautiful or famous, or all that. And then you look at those beautiful famous people, and most of them are not exactly happy, and therefore material things will never meet a relational need. And how many of them go from relationship to relationship to relationship, and divorce to divorce to divorce, because they don't really know what real relationship is, I guess. They're not finding it, because probably they're connected with people who are still looking for their needs to be met. And that's just a recipe for disaster in the end. So it is a difficult scenario for people who live conditioned by the world system. And we're living in an age which is very consumer driven. I mean, if you go back 200 years, it was sort of survival driven, whereas today it's consumer and leisure and driven. Then you did need to do something to earn, to buy some food to live. That was pretty much all you could afford, and people survived. Today, the advertising industry and the consumer industry is saying you need all these things to make you happy. And without these things, you won't be happy. And then they push the brands. If you don't have this brand of trainer or sports clothes or other wear, then you won't be accepted, or you won't be good enough. Therefore, it's all pressure to be like something or somebody, and that will be sold you by the advertising people. So they'll push a particular image of girls, men that other women aspire to be like, and they're usually not overweight people, are they? So they're usually very fit, healthy, beautiful looking models and everything else. There aren't too many models who've got a few extra pounds on them, because they don't get the jobs. Now, there are some that have broken that mold slightly, but in a sense, they're still selling something. They're selling something for the bigger woman. So it's like, and all of that type of thing, which is all really what we have developed as a system, which is the best we can come up with. And our own religions are the best we can come up with, and our own education, and all the things that we've developed. You go into the third world, as we call it, and they're very different. I mean, I like watching programs that when they go out into the jungle and they go and meet the tribes and people like that. And there's this particular guy who I follow, and he went into these places somewhere in Africa, and he lived with the tribe, a couple of tribes for a few weeks. And he found their simple lifestyle refreshing, because they didn't have all this need for this and that and the other. And they, as a whole tribe, they went and brought down the harvest of the things and the trees and all this stuff. And it was like, and I think he was like, yeah, there's something about this which is deeper than all the superficial stuff that we would see. I mean, you can imagine going into a school today and saying, well, for the next 2 years, you're just going to live without any clothes other than a loincloth. You're going to live in the jungle, and you're not going to have any technology, and you're not going to have any of that stuff, and you're just going to survive. But their community and their family and their looking out for each other was just amazing. And they felt part of something.
They were probably very happy.
They are, because they have not been exposed to the Western, you need all this stuff. And people will look at them and say, oh, I wouldn't want to live like that. But what would you trade? Would you want to be happy, or would you want to have stuff? No, some people say, well, I want both. Okay, and you can have stuff and be happy. But I think there has to be a spiritual joy that enables you to live in the world without being sad because you don't have things, or enough of them, or big enough of them, and all of those things, which puts the value on relationship at a higher level and shows what is really important, I guess. And we all have been in broken relationships and different situations, and where, you know, we've not been happy. And so people are pursuing happiness, but how? You know, and generally it's because of a value system that we've been culturally sort of conditioned by, to feel we need this and we need this and we need all these things to be happy. And it's so easy to be drawn into it, you know, because it's around us all the time and we're bombarded with it. And social media and TV and everything else, you know. But Jesus made it more simple. Follow me, you know, and he'll lead us into something that where his joy will be in us and our joy will be full, that we'll have his peace with us, that we'll know we're loved. And that is, I think, the rest that God is wanting to bring us into, that we can rest in him. And the rest of those things won't hold us or drive us, you know, to have more or need more. You know, and there are some people who are finding a simpler lifestyle. You know, they've had enough with all of that stuff and they just want to get off and live out in the wilderness somewhere off the grid, you know, and that's great. If that's what they want to do, great. You know, for me, would I want to live off grid out in the wilderness? Probably not. But I like visiting, you know, and sort of going and seeing the wilderness and whatever. I probably wouldn't have lived there. But ultimately, would I be able to be content in the wilderness? If I am content in myself in God, yes, because it's not based in where I live or what I have. It's based in who I am in that relationship. And therefore, I could be happy anywhere as long as I'm in that relationship. And realize that what's around me are not what's really important, but it's the relationship that I have in the intimacy of God and knowing who I am within that relationship and resting in that, which there is no performance in that at all. It is just purely a love relationship. And God wants us to love each other the way he loves us, so that we can live in the same family.
This thing about, like when Jesus said, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So it looks like what he's saying is the material world around us is a product of our consciousness, what we observe and what we experience. And so then we come to that question of which came first, the chicken or the egg. Is it consciousness that came first? Are we a product of God's consciousness? So when Bill is saying that God spoke, because we know from quantum physics that it's possible to change the neutron or the direction of a particle to make it into a wave.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, yes, but we then chose our own consciousness independent of God. So we became self-aware through independence, and that is what the problem has been. Because therefore we don't frame and reference everything from God. We frame it from ourselves. And that is created, what we've done is created all of these things through our own consciousness and our own choices, but independently of God. Therefore, but with this sort of deep down thing, there must be a God, so how are we here? So we sort of then developed our own religious thing and then there's a sort of deep down guilt somewhere within people that makes them think they need to do something to assuage that guilt with God. So we come up with all these religious systems to do that. All of that has sort of been developed because of our independence and having to operate, but being made in the image of God that we can create. And we have created the world that we live in through our own consciousness, but it's independent of God to a degree. There's still some things that I think we've created that are a reflection of God in us and being made in the image of God, beauty and art and things like that, which I think are sort of very deep down aspects of God who is creative, and we're made in his image and likeness. So there's still some, it's not totally independent, but our consciousness is been disconnected from God. There is more of a instinct that is at play, but our consciousness, the way we think, has been independent of God. Therefore, I think it's in Proverbs where it says that as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. Therefore, our thinking has to be renewed if we're going to come back into who we really are and not be stuck in this construct, And I think some scientists I was reading the other day, some people said this for a while now, but they said, no, this really mathematically appears like a simulation that we're in. It bears the hallmarks of a simulation. Now, I don't believe that we're in a simulation that God just created for us, although he has created the universe for us to live in and dwell in. So there's one sense you could say that might have an element of truth to it, but we have generated our own conscious reality. And God is wanting to renew our minds, so our minds are renewing us to a true reality of what he always intended, which is why restoration is so important. And therefore, we can choose certain levels of reality and live in delusion. We can delude ourselves totally by creating a fantasy world to live in. And actually, if you think of the analogy of the Matrix type of thing, is this true reality? Well, not as God intended it, but it is the reality which we have created and we live within it. But God is within us, within it, and wants us to know the truth so that reality we've created, which effectively is divisive and national and all of the negative things that are going on in the world, there are choices. We've tried together and fought for our land and national interests and all of those things, rather than living from a perspective of relationship. and union with one another and family, rather than tribalism and competitiveness and all of the sort of way in which we've developed. Rather than everyone being blessed, which was what covenant was, we've developed competition, and that creates conflict. So we've got to get more, and we've got to beat the other person, or we have got to have the higher trade, you know, all that. Because what does that do? Well, that makes us prosperous. And now you've got Trump coming in, threatening to put, you know, I don't know what percent of tariffs on Canadian imports. And then if he did, what will they do? Well, they'll put the price up, you know. Yeah, it's just self-defeating when everyone's out for their own interest, rather than we are here for the benefit of everybody together in relationship, which is what covenant is. In covenant is what's mine is yours and what's yours is mine, and we want to bless each other. We're not going to compete with each other. When people start to see that well-being and happiness is more important than materialism, then they'll start gravitating, looking for a different way. And I think God is behind that, wanting people to look at a different way of life that is based in love and joy and peace, you know, rather than competition and competing with each other for what? The bigger slice of the pie, or whatever, you know, way you look at it, sadly. So hopefully, if our minds are renewed to a level where we start to not be conformed to the world or the conscious reality that we have been framed into believing, then our minds will be renewed to see a different reality, which is possible if we pursue it. And our renewed minds will enable us not to be conformed to a mold which is world shaped, and we will have the opportunity of thinking differently about ourselves because we're in agreement with God. That is the whole understanding of metanoia, agreeing with God about ourselves. That is what renewing of our mind is all about, you know, with God mind, you know, agreeing with the vast sum of his thoughts about us and all those amazing things, you know. But for that to take place, we've got to have our minds renewed to stop thinking like the world in which we've been conditioned into believing is true reality. You know, so I don't think they're totally wrong when they're looking at viewing it as some sort of simulation. But someone outside didn't create the simulation. We have created a delusion to live in through our own unrenewed consciousness. And God is wanting us to have our consciousness renewed to see the reality that he intended us to live in.
Like even today, the advances in AI, cybernetics, and neural networks and all that, and the mechanization of normal sort of ordinary, the way we look at things, we could literally have abundance, absolutely heaven on earth, solve all the current problems that we have. But everything depends on the benevolence or malevolence of the ruling people. Is heaven on earth going to be for everyone, or is it only going to be for them? That is the question now.
Yeah, well, it wouldn't be heaven on earth because it would be our version of hell on earth, actually.
A better world, that's what I mean.
It's a here are all the problems we face, let's solve them. You won't solve the problem of a need for love and a need for a relationship. All you're doing is creating conditions to which you can live longer and have more things and have less labor it's sort of a utopia of our own making, but it isn't heaven. It isn't God's presence amongst us and God's restored relationship and his government, which is a government within love. So, any governmental system that man has made, however good it seems to be, is ruled by people who are not inherently good, in the sense of they're not living from a standard of God's goodness and love. They're framing it out of something. And, I haven't seen any political system that is without flaws, which are based in the people who actually lead it. Communism has, well, you look at the ideology, everyone's all equal and everyone's wonderful and we all look after each other, and it's wonderful. Isn't it wonderful? And then you get the people who run it. Well, yeah, but we don't. We run it, so we need to live in better houses, and we need to have more, and we need to be able to have this because we're representing our nation. Therefore, we need to show that we're prosperous, and it's flawed, and all of them are flawed, and therefore, material, the Western, whatever economic systems you look to have, and they're all flawed, and you could have a wonderful dictator, so long as he wasn't flawed. If he's flawed, look out, because you're going to upset him in some way, and then you're going to suffer his wrath. Well, God isn't a dictator, he's a father. So if we're looking to fix everything, we've got to remember that we created the problems in the first place. So if we fix them, we're probably just likely to create more problems that we then have to fix. And who's going to fix them? The people who created them. So they'll probably make more problems. And we find that all over. You see it in the world. You introduce this animal into a country, because you got a problem with this, and then you didn't foresee what would happen. That you didn't see at the time that, oh no, this has changed the whole ecosystem, that now we don't have this. And it's a problem when we try and fix things with our limited knowledge rather than outworking the heart of God. And if we outwork the heart of God, God wants everyone to be blessed. He wants everyone to know him and to be secure in his love, and therefore not threatened by anybody else, and able to love and honor and respect everybody else for their differences and celebrate differences rather than be threatened by them. But we live in a world that has always been threatened by people who are different, and therefore those people are often treated differently. And you look at the modern world and you think, how we've progressed. Well, you've got more slavery today than you had in the 19th century. It's just called something else, but it's still there because people treat people with disrespect because they're not as good as me. And you have the same flaws because of people. And when people come to know God and know themselves, then things change. But we can't do it using man-made systems, which is, why Zion City in Chicago, whatever, failed, because it was started using the same systems of government and trying to fix it and creating a new high priest and all this stuff, and it just failed, sadly.
But part of the problem, isn't it, because we as a whole don't know God and we don't see ourselves as in the image of God. We see others as, within society, at least I think we do in Canada now, as a commodity. And with slavery and everything else, it's a commodity. It's like, and that's why they're looking at, gross national product is a measurement of productivity of the individual. When you have enough individuals, that's your gross national product. Now we'll substitute robotics, and that'll just create endless wealth because that's a commodity. But so our commodity, because of that, it becomes worth even less because we lose our value. But the problem is because how we see each other.
Well, that's absolutely true. I mean, and you've got things like, in Canada, this whole thing where assisted dying thing, where, well, if your mental health isn't up, well, let's assist you to die because you're not valuable to society anymore.
And we lead the world.
Yeah.
Euthanasia.
I know. And it's like, and we've just passed a bill to look at it in Parliament of assisted dying. And it's like, the arguments are, well, is this a slippery slope? And I'm sure when assisted dying was brought in Canada, it didn't have things in it that would effectively allow anyone to be killed if they didn't really want to live anymore.
My doctor, when I was getting my prescription renewed, he said, when you turn 75, they won't be paying for this anymore. And I said, why not? He said, what they're doing, they've turned around and they've had the studies done only up to the age of 75. Therefore, they'll turn now and they're going to say, we have no evidence from 75 on if it's beneficial, even though nothing's changed. And he said, that's how they're going to save money. And I said, so what's going to happen? He said, well, people as they get older are going to be in big trouble.
Yeah.
Even though they say we're going to cover everything. The health plans, like in England or in the UK, it's a mess there, their health system too.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult when you place value on people according to a certain measure and standard. And life is valuable, but some people's lives don't seem to be as valuable as others because they're either not productive or they're a burden on society. And then you start programming into older people, or you're becoming a burden on your family. And therefore, I might as well just die and stop being a burden on my family then. And these sort of things, they get programmed into society in a very sort of deceptive way. I mean, 10, 15, 20 years ago, if you would have said, oh, Canada, you'll be able to kill off people with mental health just because they've got no value to society, you'd thought that's never going to happen in Canada. Would you? I mean, but how has it happened?
Yeah.
Bit by bit by bit, there's been a sort of insidious infusion of those thoughts into the nation. And people say, yeah, but that's the government. Well, who voted the government in? The majority of the people, or whoever it works in Canada, not the majority of the people in most countries, but but they voted in, and therefore they sort of are there to reflect the people, supposedly.
Yeah.
But the people don't know what's going on, or who, like Trudeau's good looking, so let's vote him in. I've heard that before. Like it's insane.
I once said to a lady that worked with me that was a Dutch reform, and she was in her mid-40s, and she was really against abortion. And and when Trudeau ran the first time, she was a big supporter of it. And I said, Angela, do you realize that you can't even be in the Liberal Party now if you're against abortion? You can't even run for a seat. And I said, that stands against what you believe, even though she's a big supporter. And she looked at me and she said, he's so good looking. I don't care. I know what I feel. It's just, and that's the problem. People think with their emotions and all the other crazy stuff. But it was kind of funny, but it just shows the disconnect between even what she believed. And
but then that is ultimately going back to our consciousness, our own choices. We've created this.
Yes.
It's like all these things are people having done these things and start thinking these ways that start to put less value on people because they're not productive or they're a burden and all of that. Well, in years gone by, communities looked after each other. When the old got old, their children looked after them, they cared for them because they honored and respected them because they did that for them when they were little.
Yes.
And it was something which had an intrinsic value in it all, but it just seems to be becoming less and less that way, because there's these, I guess, ideologies that infuse culture driven by something. Where does it come from?
When Debbie talked about, the honesty of, she's kind of referring to the media. We really don't know, but the honesty really starts with ourselves, and we're not even honest with ourselves. So if I might be a conservative, if they're saying something is wrong, I don't go with the flow. I say that doesn't tie in. No, that's wrong. And I don't think we're able to do that as much anymore. We rationalize for the better or more common good of what's trying to be achieved.
Well,
Just a black and white thing. I realize things aren't black and white, but a lot of things are black and white. If she didn't believe in abortion, then it doesn't, her thinks that, well, it doesn't matter because, well, then you don't really believe that.
No, you don't. If you really did, you would not put other things above it.
Yes.
In your own belief system, and other people who hold to, pro-life stance don't seem to have the same stance when it comes to capital punishment. Yeah, but the Bible says an eye for an eye. It's like, well, I think Jesus came to change that view, but they still hold to it. It's like, oh, well, pro-life, yeah, that's all about unborn babies. Well, what about all the other people who are being killed off? It was very interesting in the final time of Trump's administration. More people got executed than virtually any other time in a presidential history, and under Biden's, he's basically pardoned more people than anybody else.
Yeah, but you know what? The executions are state determined, so it's not really Trump so much. He might be for it.
No, on federal ones. It's federal ones.
Okay.
You can pardon federal crimes, or you can say they need executing, and basically a whole lot of federal crimes were executed, and this time a whole lot of federal crimes have been pardoned. So it's
what he's done now,
yeah, he's just pardoned a whole load of people who were on death row rather than executing them. Well, hey, that's more pro-life than a lot of on the other side of the political scale who would have basically executed them all. So it's like,
I don't really follow that, because I think they've shown in statistics, and maybe I'm wrong here, that when they look at a place like Texas, where it's now more difficult to get an abortion, there's more children being born. So that far exceeds the number of people, the 37 people that have been sentences that have been commuted, versus thousands of children that are being born in Texas.
Oh, yeah, I'm not talking about it in numbers. I'm talking.
Well, okay, I'm sorry. I was talking about
it in a political sense.
Yeah.
Of those who are pro-life don't seem to be as much pro-life when it comes to executions.
Yeah, but the people being executed are not nice people. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Babies are
Of course
innocent.
they're not. But actually, is God for capital punishment? I don't believe so. Absolutely not, because life is life to God. People are people. He's forgiven everybody, anybody.
But that comes down to, if before, I thank the Lord that I got to meet you, because I'd still be on the old thing that not everyone makes it, and you just don't love everybody. That was my church upbringing.
Yeah.
And so I understand what they're doing. They're and the ones that are for capital punishment are the fervent believers.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Because that's their mindset. I would have been. I'm one of them. I was.
And that's what I'm trying to say is people who are fervent believers in pro-life when it comes to babies are not pro-life when it comes to capital punishment.
Yeah.
But how do you reconcile that? It's not okay to kill babies, which I totally agree with. It's not okay to kill babies, but it's not okay to kill older people either, or anybody.
But they would think, they're based on their mindset and what they understand, that's what God would want.
Well, yeah, I know. So the paradox in that is,
and it's paradox.
The sort of the Democrats who are sort of pro-abortion are actually pardoning a whole load of people and not killing as many of them on death row, which is like, oh, that's a bit of a thing. Oh, they're happy here, but they're not happy. But the other guys they're happy on this one and they're not happy here. So it's like, none of this doesn't work. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
When you're basing things on your own value system and understanding, you're never going to get it to work. And it doesn't, which is why we're in the situations we're all in, because we're all living in governmental systems which basically are not God's kingdom and don't work.
And really, if you look at it, I think you want to take it a step forward further, the whole penal system and needs such reform because it's supposed to be rehabilitation, and people shouldn't be assaulted or anything else. And the fact is, these people that have done these horrible crimes that Debbie said, no one's against them being locked up, but treated as humans.
Yeah, prison system.
Totally, yeah. I mean, I'm not against, sort of rehabilitating, but I think, restorative justice is the way things should happen, not punitive justice, because all you do in punitive wise is you just create a bigger problem. Restoring people and getting people restored so they don't commit those things again, well, how do you do that? By helping them value life and value their own life and the life of other people, rather than the system that has developed people like that. So yeah, it's chaos if we're going to look at our own understanding. But I believe God is restoring people by renewing people's minds. And I think all of this whole thing of a different version of God, that God isn't angry, punitive and vindictive and going to punish people and torment them forever, is the first steps, I think, to actually seeing a different society, because that is what people have based their political systems on. I mean, the Western world is based on the Judeo-Christian ethic. That's what they say is based on. And the Muslim world is based on their ethical system. And both of their systems are flawed totally and don't work. So ultimately we're going to have to change to see who God really is and base our government on who God is in love, rather than the systems that we've developed. And I think that's the only hope, I think, is that more and more people discover God and discover his love and therefore start loving each other, that will eventually change the world. And Jesus didn't say it was revolution. He says it was an infiltration, like leavening the whole lump.
It will change
the process,
the collective consciousness of all mankind. Everybody thinks God is love.
Well, if people did and people acted on that, then the world would change dramatically, which is why I think there's an awakening to God being love. And the religious systems are being challenged, particularly the Christian ones, which are contradictory to God being love and his love being unconditional, which is what true love is and what true understanding of God is, that it's all unconditional and not based on any conditions, particularly the ones that we've created for ourselves. Anyway, all right, I need to leave it there, but if you enjoy these videos, would you please take a moment to like, comment and subscribe? It really does help. Thank you very much.